The dust settled on everything, a fine coat of powdered earth that muted the color of the world and got into the lungs and into the soul. It settled on the cracked leather of the saddle left out too long, on the tin cup by the water pump, and on the weathered face of the man who called this expanse of silence and heat his own. His name was Elias, though few had cause to use it, and he was mending a fence line that marked the edge of his property, a lonely geometry drawn against an indifferent landscape. The post had been split clean through, not by weather or by beast, but by the careless force of something passing in a hurry, and he worked with a quiet economy of motion that spoke of long practice and a deep-seated need for order in a world that offered none. He dug the new hole with a steady rhythm, the twin handles of the post hole digger rising and falling, the dry soil giving way with a soft, grinding sigh. The sun was a hammer at the top of the sky, relentless and white, and the sweat that ran down his temples carved clean paths through the dust on his skin, each drop a tiny, fleeting river. He did not rush his work because rushing was a fool's game out here, a waste of energy that you might need later just to stay alive. And so he moved with the land's own pace, slow, deliberate, and certain. He set the new post, a solid piece of cured cedar that smelled of resin and time, and tamped the earth around its base with the heavy end of a crowbar, each thud a satisfying, solid beat in the vast quiet. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine white lines of old scars, knew the heft of the tool, and the feel of the wood and the resistance of the soil. They were capable hands. They knew how to build, how to fix, how to hold on. When the post was secure, solid as a tooth in a jawbone, he stretched the wire, the metal groaning as he tightened it with the claw of his hammer, until it sang with a low, tense hum when he plucked it. He stood back for a moment, his eyes narrowed against the glare, and surveyed the line of the fence running away to a shimmering, heat-hazed horizon. It was a small thing, one repaired post in a mile of wire, but it was his. It was a line drawn, a declaration of order, a promise kept to himself. The world inside the wire was his to manage. The world outside was not. He turned and walked back toward the small, sturdy cabin that sat alone in the center of it all, a dark shape against the endless pale brown of the plains. His shadow stretched long and thin behind him. The day was ending. That night, he was cleaning a rifle on the porch, the metallic scent of oil and solvent sharp in the cooling air, when he first sensed the wrongness. It wasn't a sound, not at first, but a disruption in the familiar pattern of silence, a texture in the quiet that shouldn't have been there. He set the rifle down, his movements fluid and soundless, and listened. The crickets had stopped their ceaseless song. The wind, which had been whispering through the dry grass all evening, had fallen still. He stood up and moved to the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the faint yellow lamplight spilling from his window. And then he saw it, a shape, huddled and small, near the stone wall of the well. It was not an animal. Animals did not hold themselves with that particular brand of desperate stillness. He picked up the rifle again, not to aim it, but to hold it, its weight a familiar comfort in his hand, and stepped off the porch, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. He moved slowly, circling wide, keeping the shape between him and the faint light from the cabin. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a person, a woman, collapsed against the cold stone, her form a bundle of rags and exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, a dry, rasping sound that was the only noise in the world. He stopped a few feet away, the rifle held loose at his side. He could see the pale oval of her face turned up toward the star-dusted sky, her eyes closed, her hair a tangled mess sticking to her sweat-sheened skin. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and the hem was caked with mud and something darker that he did not want to name. She was a stray, blown in by some ill wind, and strays in this country were often more trouble than a man could afford. He should have told her to move on. He should have turned back to his porch and his rifle and his quiet, ordered life. He did neither. Instead, he leaned the rifle against the well and worked the pump handle, the iron squealing in protest, until a stream of cold, clear water gushed into the wooden bucket below. He filled a tin dipper and knelt beside her. "Water," he said. The word was rough from disuse, a stone in his throat. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and dark, with a fear so profound it seemed to steal the very air. She flinched away from him, scrambling backward until her shoulders hit the stone wall. She made no sound. He did not move closer. He simply set the dipper on the ground between them, the metal making a soft clink, and stood up, backing away to give her space. He retreated to the porch and watched from the shadows as, after a long, silent moment, a trembling hand reached out and took the cup. Days later, she stayed in the barn, a silent ghost who lived among the scent of hay and old leather. Elias had not offered the house, and she had not asked for it. A silent agreement of boundaries that suited them both. He left food and a bucket of fresh water by the barn door each morning and each evening, and each time he returned, the plate and cup were empty. He never saw her take them. He only saw the evidence of her continued existence. And for now, that was enough. He went about his work, the familiar rhythms of the ranch a bulwark against the unsettling presence of the stranger in his midst. He repaired a harness, his hands moving with practiced skill over the worn leather, stitching and oiling until it was strong again. He reset a loose stone in the foundation of the cabin. He cleared brush from the creek bed that cut through the north pasture, but his awareness was always tuned to the barn, a low hum of attention beneath the surface of his thoughts. He would catch glimpses of her sometimes, a flicker of movement in the shadows of the doorway, a fleeting silhouette against the setting sun. She never came out into the open. She was like a wild thing, wounded and wary, and he knew enough to let her be. He knew that healing, like the mending of a fence, took its own time. One afternoon, he returned from the pastures to find one of his work shirts, one he had left hanging on a peg by the barn door with a torn sleeve, folded neatly on the porch steps. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of stitches, so fine, and even they were nearly invisible. He picked up the shirt, the mended cloth soft against his rough fingers. It was a message, a thank you. A quiet declaration that she was more than just a frightened creature huddled in the hay. She had a skill, she had a past where she had learned to make things whole again. He looked toward the barn, but there was no sign of her. The silence that came from it felt different now, less like an absence and more like a held breath. That evening, he left a second plate with his own meal. This one with a piece of cornbread and a dollop of honey from the small hive he kept. He didn't know why, it just felt right. He ate his own dinner on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the deep velvet sky. He was a man, accustomed to solitude, who had cultivated it like a crop, but tonight the quiet felt less empty. It felt shared. The riders appeared as a smudge of dust on the western horizon, a disturbance that grew steadily larger and more defined until it resolved into 3 men on horseback. Elias saw them from the far pasture where he was checking the water levels in the stock tank. He did not run. He did not hide. He simply finished his task, his movements as deliberate as ever, and then swung himself onto his own horse, a steady bay gelding, and rode back toward the cabin at a calm, unhurried walk. He knew who they were before they were close enough to see their faces. Trouble rode with a particular kind of arrogance in this country, a carelessness for the land it crossed. They were already inside his fence line when he reached the yard, their horses trampling the very ground he had so carefully tended. The man in the lead was Silas Kane, a rancher from the next county, whose holdings grew larger each year through methods that were whispered about but never challenged. Kane was smiling, a thin, predatory expression that did not reach his cold, pale eyes. He wore a fine coat despite the heat, a sign of a man who believed the world should bend to his comfort, and his boots were polished to a high shine. Beside him were 2 men whose faces were hard and empty, their hands resting near the butts of the pistols holstered on their hips. "Elias," Kane said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "Been a while. Your place is looking tidy." The word was an insult, a dismissal of the small, hard-won order of Elias's life. Elias dismounted and stood by his horse, his hand resting on the warm neck of the animal. He did not speak. He waited. "I'm looking for something," Kane continued, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on the cabin, the well, the barn. "Something of mine. A piece of property that seems to have wandered off. Flighty thing. Ungrateful." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Goes by the name of Lena. Small dark hair, frightened eyes. You seen anyone like that?" From the corner of his eye, Elias saw a flicker of movement in the shadows of the barn. She was listening. He kept his own eyes fixed on Kane, his expression unreadable. He had spent a lifetime building a face that gave nothing away. "Just my livestock here," Elias said, his voice flat. "They're all accounted for." Kane's smile widened. "Is that so? I heard a rumor you'd taken in a stray, a 2-legged one." He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching in the dirt. He walked toward the barn, his movements casual, proprietary. "Let's just have a look, shall we?" To satisfy my curiosity, one of his men moved to follow, but Elias took a single step forward, a small, quiet movement that nonetheless brought the man to a halt. This is my land, Elias said, his voice still quiet, but with a new edge of steel beneath it. You're not welcome in my barn. Cain stopped and turned, his smile finally vanishing. His eyes were like chips of ice. Your land? This land belongs to whoever is strong enough to hold it, Elias. A lesson you seem to have forgotten. The moment hung in the shimmering heat, brittle and sharp. Cain's gaze was a physical weight, a challenge that demanded an answer. He took another step toward the barn, a deliberate trespass, and then another. His men shifted, their hands no longer resting near their guns but on them. From the deep shadows of the barn came a small, choked sound, the whimper of a trapped animal, and it was enough. Cain's cruel smile returned. Ah, he said softly. There she is. He strode to the barn door and reached inside, his arm disappearing into the darkness. There was a brief struggle, a muffled cry, and then he dragged her out into the merciless sunlight. It was Lena. She stumbled, her face pale with terror, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. Cain held her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. His grip, a statement of ownership. She was a thing to him, a possession to be reclaimed. A small crowd had begun to gather at the edge of the property, townspeople drawn by the sight of the riders, their faces curious and impassive. They stood by the fence line Elias had so carefully mended, a silent chorus of witnesses who would do nothing. They were part of the landscape, as indifferent as the dust in the sky. You see, Cain said, his voice pitched for the audience. Lost property. Found. He pulled her closer, his face leaning down to hers. She flinched, trying to turn away, but he caught her chin with his other hand, forcing her to look at him. You need to be reminded of your place, girl, he whispered, the words a venomous caress. You need to remember who you belong to. And then, in front of Elias, in front of the silent town, he lowered his head and pressed his mouth to hers. It was not a kiss. It was an act of violence, a brand of humiliation and power. Her body went rigid, a statue of pure terror, her hands clenched into small, white-knuckled fists at her sides. He held her there for a long moment, a demonstration of his absolute control, before he released her with a shove that sent her staggering. She caught herself before she fell, wrapping her arms around her own body as if to hold herself together. Cain laughed, a low, ugly sound. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He had made his point. He had won. Elias had not moved. He had watched the entire brutal display with a stillness that was absolute, his face a mask of weathered stone. He had seen the terror in her eyes, the violation, the casual cruelty of a man who believed his strength gave him the right to break smaller things. He saw the silent, watching townspeople, their inaction a form of consent, and in that frozen moment, something inside him, something long dormant and carefully buried, finally broke the surface. He moved. It was not a large movement. He simply took one step forward, planting his feet in the dust of his own yard. It was enough to draw every eye to him. That's enough, he said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the afternoon quiet with the clean, sharp finality of a closing door. Cain turned, an expression of amused disbelief on his face. Enough? I'll decide when it's enough, old man. He gestured to Lena. This is my business. Not on my land, Elias said. He took another step, closing the distance between them, his gaze never leaving Cain's. He was not armed, save for the strength in his hands and the unyielding certainty in his eyes. He stopped directly in front of Cain, so close that the other man was forced to look up slightly to meet his gaze. Elias ignored him. He looked past Cain, at Lena. She was still trembling, her face ashen, her eyes still locked on some distant horror. He spoke to her, his voice low and steady, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of fear. It was not for Cain to hear, or for the town. It was only for her. That is not what a man does, he said softly. That is not what it is supposed to feel like. The words were simple, plain, unornamented, but in them he offered her something that Cain, with all his power and wealth, could never understand. He offered her dignity. He was showing her that what had been done to her was wrong, that it was not the way of the world, but an aberration, a sickness. He was showing her that she was a person, not property. It was a promise, a quiet vow to restore a piece of the world that had been broken. Cain's face darkened with fury. The quiet rancher's defiance was a greater insult than any shouted threat. You'll regret that, Cain snarled, and he nodded to his men. Teach him some manners. The two men moved at once, converging on Elias from either side, their faces set in grim, professional masks. They were confident, used to their strength and the fear it inspired. They expected a quick, brutal end to the matter. They were wrong. The man they moved to attack was not the quiet, solitary rancher they saw. The years of mending fences and tending stock had been a kind of peace, a long, slow penance. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Elias did not tense or square up like a brawler. He flowed. As the first man reached for him, Elias shifted his weight, turning inside the man's grasp, his hand coming up to strike not with a fist, but with the hard heel of his palm. A sharp, precise blow to the man's throat. The man gagged, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and stumbled backward, his hands flying to his neck as he fought for air he could no longer find. The second man, seeing his partner fall, hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Elias needed. He closed the distance, his movements economical and devastatingly efficient. He deflected the man's clumsy punch, his forearm redirecting the blow, and drove his own fist into the man's solar plexus. The air left the man's lungs in a single, explosive whoosh. He folded in on himself, collapsing to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The yard was suddenly, shockingly silent, save for the ragged gasping of the two men on the ground. The townspeople at the fence line stared, their mouths agape. This was not what they had expected. Elias stood between the two fallen men, his breathing even, his stance relaxed. He had not broken a sweat. He looked like he had done nothing more strenuous than lift a saddle. He turned his gaze back to Silas Kane. The rich man's arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by a mixture of shock and a dawning, primal fear. The world he understood, a world governed by wealth and brute force, had just been turned upside down by a quiet man with calloused hands. Kane's face was pale, his composure shattered. He had misjudged his opponent so completely, so fundamentally, that the very ground beneath his feet felt unsteady. Humiliation warred with rage on Kane's face. He had been made a fool of on another man's land, in front of men who worked for him and people whose fear he cultivated. This was an insult that could not stand. His hand darted to the ornate, silver-inlaid pistol at his hip, his fingers fumbling for the grip. It was the desperate act of a man whose authority had been broken, reaching for the only tool he had left. But Elias was already moving. He did not draw a weapon of his own. He did not need one. He lunged forward, covering the space between them in 2 long strides, his hand shooting out, not for the gun, but for Kane's wrist. He caught it just as the pistol cleared the leather, his grip a band of iron. With a sharp, brutal twist, he torqued Kane's arm, forcing the gun from his spasming fingers. The pistol spun through the air and landed in the dust with a soft thud. Elias did not release his grip. He held the man's wrist, applying a steady, excruciating pressure, until Kane cried out, his face contorted in pain. "My land," Elias said again, his voice a low growl, each word a spike of iron. "My rules." He shoved Kane away from him. The man stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, his eyes wide with a fear that was no longer abstract, but immediate and personal. He had come here as a predator, a wolf among sheep, and had found a bear instead. Elias bent down and picked up Kane's pistol from the dust. He did not point it, he held it loosely, its weight insignificant in his hand. He looked at Kane, then at the silent crowd, and finally back at Kane. He broke the pistol open, the cylinder spinning free, and emptied the cartridges into his other hand. They fell like heavy, brass tears. He tossed the empty gun back to Kane, who caught it clumsily. It was a useless piece of metal now, a symbol of his impotence. "Get off my land," Elias said. The command was absolute. "And don't come back." For a moment, Kane just stood there, his mind struggling to process the totality of his defeat. Then, his eyes flickered toward the watching townspeople, and he saw not fear or respect, but a cold, assessing curiosity. His power here was gone, broken in the dust of this small, tidy yard. Without another word, he turned, his movements stiff and awkward, and walked to his horse. His 2 men, one still gasping for air, the other struggling to his knees, staggered after him. They mounted their horses and rode away, not with the arrogance they had arrived with, but with the haste of a beaten retreat. The dust they raised was the dust of their own humiliation. Elias watched them until they were small figures on the horizon, and then he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He opened his hand and let the cartridges fall to the ground. Weeks later, the rhythm of the ranch returned, but it was a new rhythm. A harmony played by 2 instruments instead of one. Lena no longer stayed in the barn. She had moved into the cabin's small spare room, a space that had been used for storage for years, but was now clean and tidy, with a small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. The fear had not vanished from her eyes, not completely, but it had receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a quiet strength that was beginning to blossom in the safety of this place. She worked alongside Elias, her presence a steady, quiet counterpoint to his own. She learned the cadence of the chores, how to feed the chickens and milk the single cow. Her hands, once soft, growing capable and sure. She had a gift for gentling animals, a patience that calmed the flighty mare and earned the trust of the wary barn cat. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, the silence between them no longer a space of caution, but one of companionable ease. She would mend his clothes, her needle moving with a swift, certain grace, and he would carve small figures from scraps of wood, his knife peeling away the layers to reveal the shape hidden within. They spoke little, but they didn't need to. They communicated in the small gestures of a shared life. She learned how he took his coffee, strong and black, and would have a cup waiting for him when he came in from the morning chores. He learned that she liked to watch the sunset, and he made sure to finish his work in time so they could sit together and see the sky bleed into shades of orange and purple over the plains. One evening, as he handed her a newly carved figure of a hawk, its wings outstretched, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but for the first time, she did not flinch away. Her gaze met his, just for a second, and in her eyes, he saw not a ghost of the terror that had been there, but a flicker of something else. Gratitude, trust, a beginning. He had not offered her love in the way the poets spoke of it, a thing of fire and grand pronouncements. He had offered her something far more vital. He had offered her safety. He had offered her respect. He had stood between her and the cruelty of the world and had not wavered. He had given her a place where she could mend the broken pieces of herself, where her first kiss, given in terror, could become a distant, fading scar instead of an open wound. He had shown her what it felt like to be treated as a human being, worthy of defense, worthy of kindness. And in the quiet sanctuary of the ranch, that felt more like love than anything else in the world. The land remained harsh, a place of dust and wind and unforgiving sun, but it was no longer merely a place of solitude. It had become a refuge. The fences Elias so carefully maintained were no longer just lines on a map marking what was his. They were the boundaries of a sanctuary, a small pocket of order and decency carved out of a world that often had neither. The quiet man and the woman with the mended soul had built a life from the wreckage, their shared silence a testament to a trust that ran deeper than words. They did not talk of the future, nor did they dwell on the past. They lived in the solid, tangible present, in the warmth of the morning sun, the taste of fresh water from the well, the steady, reassuring rhythm of a day's hard work. The hawk he had carved sat on her windowsill, its wooden eyes gazing out over the plains, a silent guardian. Sometimes, she would trace its wings with her finger, the smooth wood a reminder of the strong, capable hands that had made it, the same hands that had stood against the darkness and pushed it back. His promise had been kept, not with flowery speeches or grand gestures, but with the steady, daily act of being a good man in a world that made it easy to be otherwise. He had shown her that strength was not the power to dominate, but the courage to protect. He had shown her that a person's worth was not something that could be taken by force, but something innate, to be honored and defended. And in showing her, he had reminded himself of the man he had once tried to be, the man he thought he had buried long ago. She had not just found a refuge on his land, she had brought one to him, a refuge from the solitude that had been both his shield and his prison. Together, they had mended more than just a broken fence. They had mended a piece of the world. There are moments in every life that draw a line, a clear demarcation between the person you were and the person you will become. A choice made, a word spoken, a hand offered in kindness when another is raised in cruelty. These are the moments that define us, not by the noise they make, but by the quiet, unshakable truth they reveal. They show us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. They teach us that the deepest wounds are not always the ones that bleed, and the most profound healing often happens in the silence, in the steady, patient work of rebuilding what was broken. We all have fences that need mending, boundaries that protect the quiet core of who we are. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is stand on our own small piece of land and declare, simply and without fanfare, that this is a place of decency, that here, kindness will be the rule. Thank you for spending this time with us, for walking this dusty road for a little while. If this story found a place in you, a like, or a comment lets us know that our time together meant something. And if you choose to subscribe, you won't miss the next story we have to share. Until then, be the person who offers the cup of water. Be the one who stands up. Be good to each other.